before I begin this evening, I want to mention that there may be some people who are joining us by live stream, and I'm not certain, but it may be possible that some of the images of the lecture you won't be able to see because I do not have permission from the temples in Japan for more than fair use or one-time use of these images. So it may be that only those of you who are actually here in the audience are able to see those images. But I hope that if you cannot see them, it will cause you to look for them in catalogs and other places. And I'll try to mention where you might see them. So I would like to thank the Asia Society, and in particular curator Adriana Proser, for giving me the opportunity to present to you on this occasion. In addition to our current predicament of Shinkei coronavirus, or the COVID-19, Japan is many hours ahead of us, but it's also the anniversary of 3/11, when we had the terrible disaster of the tsunami and earthquake and a subsequent crisis in Fukushima. So for those people who are still deeply affected by that crisis, I hope that our ongoing interest and love of Japanese culture will give them some warmth in their hearts. So I would also like to thank Dr. John Weber for collecting Japanese art, and with his curator, Julia Meach, for generously making his collection available to people. One, by permitting its display in fantastic exhibitions like the one now on view, as well as by opening his home to scholars for research viewings. It's in particular a delight to see selections from the Weber collection installed alongside works from the Rockefeller collection, including pieces that Adriana has allowed me to view in storage over the years with colleagues from Japan. One cannot overstate the contributions these two collections have made in the field of Asian art history by the seemingly simple act of bringing scholars together. As brief as those encounters may be, they often spark years of exchange and collaboration that is truly lasting, often beyond the reach of a single generation. As is well known, the former director of my present institution, the Cleveland Museum of Art, Sherman Lee, served as an advisor to John D. Rockefeller in his art collecting. And it was our great pleasure to borrow the Asia Society's white Tara, acquired by Rockefeller with the guidance of Lee, to display, as you see here, as a special guest star during our centennial in 2016 as a celebration of that relationship. So, I would now like to share with you a lesson that I learned about permanence that will also permit me to correct an error that I have long wished to address. It may also perhaps be the first instance of a live-streamed, performative New York Times correction. So, in the summer of 2009, I had the privilege of displaying the painting of which you see a detail here, and which is currently on view upstairs, in an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art called Japanese Mandalas, emanations, and avatars. Having joined the staff of the Met less than a year previously, my previous interactions with the press had been rather limited. In fact, I think the most I had ever done was discuss Meiji prints with Princeton's local newspaper, Town Topics. So, of course, I was beside myself when the art critic Colin Cotter came to have a walkthrough of the exhibition before we had even completed installation. As would be expected, Cotter was an exceptionally attentive listener, and I fell all over myself trying to make the best of all possible narratives. In the process, however, I briefly fangirled into the dangerous world of embellishment. So imagine the terror I felt when I saw this line in the July 16th, 2009 New York Times review entitled, "Cosmic Map Quests to Enlightenment." I quote, "The show's organizer, Sinéad Kyo, assistant curator in the Department of Asian Art, has slipped a portrait of Kukai himself into the show. It is in a late 13th or early 14th century hand scroll illustrating his life as the great master from Koya." Oops. This evening, as I take the chance to correct myself publicly, no, we cannot, with any degree of certainty, make a claim that this particular happily eating monk is Kukai. I find comfort, nonetheless, in the final sentences of Cotter's review. He wrote, I quote, "Vows, like mandalas, have a certain creative flexibility. If desire is there and your intentions are basically true, you can see in an image what you want and fulfill a vow wherever you are. The Met is as good a place as any to begin." This is indeed the truth. So the painting over here to your right is in the collection of Nara National Museum, and it actually does depict Kukai as the 8th patriarch of the Shingon school of Buddhism, holding not a spoon and bowl, but instead a juzu, often insatisfactorily translated as a rosary, but maybe a recitation counting wristband or a mantra abacus. Doesn't really quite capture it either. And then in his other hand, he has a multi-pronged vajra. This painting is a section of a hand scroll going back. This painting, a section of a hand scroll remounted as a hanging scroll, is, however, intimately related to Kukai, the 9th century monk who founded Japan's Shingon school of Buddhism. It depicts a banquet held for about 500 monks in honor of Kukai's ordination to the highest level of esoteric Buddhism under the master Huiguo at the Qinglong Monastery in Chang'an in China in the year 805. As you can see, monks are sitting on high-backed benches being served food by attendants, and the setting is presided over by an unseen but implied Buddhist icon, its presence indicated by the offerings appearing on an altar at the top of the image. So in another version of the same scene from an intact hand scroll, now in the collection of the Freer Gallery of Art at the National Museum of Asian Art, the emphasis is on just how many monks have turned up to celebrate Kukai's ordination. And then here, in a version that dates somewhat later, in the Nambokucho period, or the latter part of the 14th century, belonging to Toji Temple in Kyoto, the presiding Buddhist icon is back. And in this case, it's hidden within a large-scale shrine with, it looks to be a lapis lazuli, or a blue beaded curtain. Now, the scene that precedes this one that we're looking at from the Toji version actually shows a large hall, which the scholar Komatsu Shigemi felt was perhaps that being used for the ordination, with wind blowing banners out of the open doors, but no actual visual access to the secret initiation. In essence, a point is being made of not showing Kukai, his master, or any of the others who may have been present at that part of this major event. So none of these images focuses on Kukai, but rather all depict the Sangha, or the Dharma community. Huiguo was said by the Kotobagaki, or the text of the hand scroll in the Toji version, to have had thousands of disciples. And yet, only 6 of these out of those thousands preserved his teachings. And further, Kukai had the distinction of being one of only 2 disciples to whom Huiguo transmitted both the womb and the diamond realms. In a sense, it is as if all of these nameless monks that we see in the banquet scene are there to demonstrate not only the momentousness of the occasion and the meritorious act of Kukai to host such a large gathering for everyone else in honor of his ordination, but also the fragility of lineage, another essential feature in addition to impermanence of the Buddhist tradition. In fact, in the face of impermanence, emphasis on the preservation and transmission of teachings and practices becomes ever more intense. So, the 13th and 14th centuries in Japan saw a proliferation of illustrated biographies of eminent monks and school patriarchs. In an unusual hand scroll belonging to Komyoji Temple in Kamakura, a section of which you see at the upper right of this slide, there are 5 scenes, each one devoted to one of 5 monks considered to be the Chinese patriarchs of the Japanese school of Pure Land Buddhism. In this scene, the 7th century monk Shandao, or known as Zendo, or Zendo Daishi in Japan, has gathered around him all manner of people, monastic and lay, of multigender and of varied age. He's demonstrating the act of uttering the name of the Buddha Amida as a means of securing birth into that Buddha's Pure Land upon death, and thereby extracting oneself from the 6 paths of transmigration, ultimately setting up a stable base for progression towards enlightenment. There is a block of text to the right of the scene that provides an abbreviated review of Shandao's studies and affiliations, and culminates in his explication of the utterance of the Nyanfo, or in Japanese, the Nembutsu, Hail Amida Buddha. In the accompanying painting, as I hope you can perhaps see in the small black and white detail I included below, it's possible to see 3 diminutive corporal depictions of Amida floating along a wiry ink line. The most famous example of this in Japanese art is the marvelous sculpture of the 10th century monk Kuya by Kosho, a son of Unke, and this exists at Rokuhara Mitsuji Temple in Kyoto and dates to the first decade of the 13th century. In the image that I've included, you can't see his legs or feet, but really I wished to emphasize that the wire is extending from his mouth with 6 little bodies of the Buddha Amida. In this case, in a recent catalog put together by Tokyo National Museum, these 6 small figures of Amida streaming from Kuya's mouth have been explained as the syllables of the Nembutsu, and they've broken it down into Na, Mu, A, Mi, Da, and then Butsu. So Butsu becomes Butsu, or one syllable. Now, apparently, there are also wooden sculptures of Shandao or Zendo that have holes in the lips, indicating that there may once have been similar features added to those works as well. And a couple of those sculptures were included in the exhibition in Tokyo, I believe in 2014. So images of Shandao, in fact, played a deeply important role in the manufacture of lineage by the disciples of Honen, who was the founder of Japan's Pure Land school of Buddhism. And he dies in very early 13th century. An important difference between Kukai, whose biography's fragment we have in this exhibition, and Honen, is that Honen never actually traveled to China. So his credentials were deeply lacking from the perspective of direct transmission. And this is something that becomes a real source of anxiety for his followers. Early biographies of Honen mitigated this issue with a dream encounter between Honen and Shandao, as well as a portrait of Shandao brought back from China at Honen's request by the very famous monk Chogen, who we know as being responsible for directing the rebuilding of Todaiji Temple in Nara. So in this particular scene, which comes from the 48 scroll version of Honen's biography and is a national treasure belonging to Chionin Temple, we see a representation of a dream that Honen has had, in which Shandao, over there on the left, descends before him on a bank of cloud, the lower half of his body appearing in gold, and he lets Honen know that he's on the right track. In fact, for Honen, in writing his Senchakushu, which was sort of the compendium of his thought and teachings, Shandao's commentary on Pure Land Sutra was central. In this copy of a narrative originally produced in 1237, which is considered the original narrative of Honen's life, and belonging to the temple Zendoji in Kyushu, Shandao appears in a portrait standing with 3 Amida emerging from his mouth. The text explains, sort of above this figure's head, who is either Honen or Chogen, that this image has been brought to Japan by Chogen from China. However, and also you can see at the bottom, like Honen's dream, the bottom part of Shandao's robe is in gold. Now, I'm not sure how well you can see this unless you know what you are looking for. But over time, this story shifts, and it becomes an image of the 5 Chinese patriarchs of Pure Land Buddhism that Chogen brings back from China. The transition in the narrative is strikingly captured in a scene in the Chionin 48 scroll biography of Honen. What we see here is an altar with an incense burner and a little bit of wispy incense coming up, a lovely sakura tree, such as we see in the screens upstairs, but also a gatsuga, or a painting within a painting, hanging along this door is a hanging scroll painting in which you have 2 different things going on. On the one hand, you have, and I don't have a pointer, but I hope you can make out. In fact, if I've got the walking mic, I can just go over here. Here is Shandao's head. And here we have Amidas. But up here, we have the head of a monk who is sitting in a chair. And then to either side, you have additional figures sitting in chairs. And so what we're really seeing is Shandao versus the image of the 5 Chinese patriarchs. By the time this scene is copied in the 15th century version of Honen's biography at Taimadera Temple, the image has fully caught up with the textual drift in the narrative, and you see that they've decided definitively that Chogen has brought back, at Honen's request, an image of the 5 Chinese patriarchs of Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism. Now, the 2 models for the paintings appearing in the Honen biographies are the portrait of Shandao at Chionji in Kyoto on the left there, where he is standing. And although it's very challenging to see in this darkened silk, there are little Amida coming from his mouth. And then another painting, which is considered to be the portrait of the 5 Chinese patriarchs of Pure Land Buddhism at Nissan Temple in Saga. The issue here is that the painting of the 5 patriarchs is not actually verified to be of the 5 patriarchs of Pure Land Buddhism. And in fact, while there is some debate as to whether it is a 12th or 13th century painting, there is agreement that it has come to Japan from China. However, it could be that the 5 patriarchs we see here are in fact the 5 patriarchs of the Keigon school of Buddhism, or the school that is engaged with the Flower Garland Sutra. In fact, the lineage selected by Honen does not really fully square with any of the official lineages in China, and Japan actually developed an official independent Pure Land school a little bit before that happened in Song Dynasty China. When Honen was active, the Pure Land Buddhist practices remained under the auspices of Tiantai in China. So in this case, what appears to have happened is that an image legitimately brought to Japan from China was then given new identities for its sitters that suited what Honen's followers needed to be the case. So both the Chionji and the Nissan portrait were copied many times, and both impacted the iconography of Shandao imagery subsequently produced. In addition to the Honen biographies, as you can see in this slide, Shandao's portrait appears in Shinran's illustrated biographies in both the hanging and hand scroll versions. There is an illustration of this particular sequence upstairs in the exhibition in the very lower register of one of the scrolls of the biography of Shinran. But in this particularly juicy version, visually, the artist combines an image of Shandao over there on the left, emitting 3 Amida, before a scene of Honen transmitting his teachings to Shinran. You see, he's handing him that book there. And in those teachings, Honen stresses Shandao's suggestion that if one is to recite the name of Amida 10 times, or even once, you can attain birth in the Pure Land. And then in the adjacent scene, you see before an image of Amida himself with a red head mandala, Honen is inscribing a portrait of himself that Shinran has had produced. And a more standard presentation is the one we see upstairs, in which in one scene Honen is working with the image, and in the other he's handing over a copy of his teachings. And what makes this one different is the inclusion of those 2 additional images within images to further guide you visually as to what's happening in those interactions between master and disciple. So these are all acts of lineage transmission. In one hand scroll version of the Shinran narrative belonging to the temple Jofukuji, we have Shandao in a textile-covered chair with his shoes placed on a stool before him, not that different from what we see in the Komyoji temple version in Kamakura. So that painting of Shandao is closely related to one in this exhibition that we see here on the left. And here Shandao is seated in the textile-covered chair, his shoes on the small platform before him. And in this case, he has 5 Amida emerging from his mouth, almost like a Namu Amida. But the painting is also related closely to one in Ryushoji Temple in Gifu Prefecture. And that's the painting over here on the right, which sadly is not as well preserved. And the Ryushoji painting shows 10 rather than 5 Amida coming from Shandao's mouth. Now, as I mentioned, Shandao's commentary on a central Pure Land sacred text is one in which he indicates that if a person intones the name of Amida even 10 times or only once, he will be reborn in Amida's Pure Land. And we know that that particular phrasing was deeply important to Honen. So people have argued that that is why we have the 10 instances of Amida appearing. And this has become the root of a suggestion that perhaps the painting we see on view upstairs could have been cut down from an original format in which there would have been 10 Amida, but because it needed to be utilized for a ritual space of a different size, it was made smaller. At the same time, as you can see on the right-hand side here, and this is from an exhibition that was held of the treasures of Zendinji in Kyoto in about 25 years ago, the number of Amida appearing to come from Shandao's mouth, as seen in these other portraits, can be as few as 3, and then sometimes actually 5, as you see in the one in the center there. And in addition, given the spacing of the presentation of the Amida in the painting upstairs, it's not entirely impossible that the group may have been complete at 5 in the painting. And it's attempts to answer this type of question that require truly close looking at a work of art. And I did this, and we can see that there have been some infills of silk added to the top of the painting, but it's very hard to ascertain whether there would or would not have been a part of a 6 Amida there. So I think if someone in the conservation world can put it on a light table or something of that nature, we might get some interesting conclusions. But what's most important here is the significance of Shandao to the Pure Land tradition, as well as his place in this lineage that is fabricated to lend legitimacy to a new organization in Japan. So as I was suggesting, this is the other side of the coin in Buddhism from impermanence, is this tremendous emphasis in all of the different schools on direct transmission from master to disciple and the correct execution of practices for maximum efficacy. So all of the paintings I've been discussing so far relate to Buddhism in Japan. And when we look at even a fragment of an illustrated biography of a Buddhist patriarch, we're invited to construct again in our minds the full narrative and to treat that surviving section as a stand-in for the whole, much like a relic or an icon. And in like fashion, when we see images indicating vocalized syllables with sacred meaning, we can hear the sound in our heads. Interacting with literary works in written form, such as the one that is on view upstairs and here in the slide, generates a similar experience. Like shomyo, the melodic vocalization of the name of the Buddha Amida prized in the Tendai and Yuzu Nembutsu schools of Buddhism, much of Japanese poetry is meant to be sung, or at least voiced. And so this very handsome calligraphy upstairs in the exhibition is identified by its postscript to be by the cloistered prince Sonnen of Shorenin. I was initially drawn to this work because of a fair amount of the kotobagaki, or text portions, in the illustrated biography of Honen at Chionin being attributed to Sonnen. In addition, the paper itself is quite luxuriously constructed and decorated with its dyed, layered sections that come across like a glaze or a sort of robust, fibrous form of tarashikomi, or dripped-in ink. And on top of that, you've got bird and butterfly designs, very precisely done in silver and gold paint. And I must admit, I was also interested because a number of the poems in the section appearing in the Miho Museum's 2015 catalog of the Weber collection were originally composed by monks. In my recent work, I have been fascinated by the role of rengae, or linked verse poetry gatherings, in the veneration of Tenjin-sama, the deified spirit of Tsugawara no Michizane, considered the kami, or deity of poetry. And on the left-hand side, you can see a large painting belonging to Hasedera Temple in Nara that I was able to show in my recent Shinto exhibition this past spring and summer. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a detail showing in the back of the room an altar set before an image of Tenjin-sama, or in a sense, it's Sugawara no Michizane in formal courtwear. And then in the room itself, on large tatami mats, you can see a group of Shingon school monks of a Hasedera temple engaged in the composing of poems being offered to Tenjin-sama. So in the same way you might offer recitations of his name to Amida, or sutras, sacred texts before an icon in a temple, it's also possible to offer poetry as a ritual activity. So in any case, this hand scroll, which is considered to have been refashioned into a hand scroll from a book at one point, it's a version of the competition between 36 illustrious poets with poems selected by the 12th century courtier known either as Fujiwara no Shunzei or Fujiwara no Toshinari. And what we see on the screen here is a portion of the fifth match of the contest. And it's a match between the priest Sosei and the courtier Kino Tomonori. Since I have been upfront about my own editorial lapses in the past, and because there is no such thing as a catalog without errata, as I can painfully know myself, I hope the editors of the Miho Museum catalog of the Weber collection will forgive me for pointing out an absolutely priceless error in their catalog. The first poem by Kino Tomonori in the fifth match between Kino Tomonori and the priest Sosei is transliterated and translated beneath the photograph of the detail of the hand scroll. However, that particular poem, the English translation only, misses a tiny bit, and in the process becomes perhaps the most compelling poem I have read in a long time. It says simply, "Why in the world have I fallen in love with that person?" And I suspect we have all been there. The poem that leads off the bout is by the priest Sosei of the 9th to early 10th century. And please forgive my pronunciation, but in Japanese it reads, "Ware no miya, aware to omoamu, kirigirisu, naku, yukage no yamato nadeshiko." And the translation in the Miho catalog reads, "Am I alone in being moved? Bush crickets chirping among the dianthus under the setting sun." Dianthus, of course, are commonly known as pinks and are indeed often a deep pink in color. And so what you end up with is the image of the setting sun, also bringing a rich pink and red hues to mind. And then you can almost imagine the embers of a fire in the cooling air, as this sun is going down and enhancing the color of these pinks. And then the sound of the crickets is coming up around you. And the poem originally appeared in the Kokinshu, or the Kokin Wakashu, the anthology of ancient and modern verse, where it was prefaced with the information that it was composed at a poetry contest held at the imperial palace in the Kampyo era, or the very last part of the 9th century. The corresponding poem selected by Toshinari to be voiced by Tomonori reads in Japanese, "Azumaji no saya no nakayama, nakanaka ni nani shika hito o omoi someken." One translation of the poem by Helen Craig McCullough is, "How casually I drifted into this love, beginning a course torturous as the Saya Pass on the road to the Eastland." Another translation I found in the work of H. Mac Horton has it, "Like between mountain in the east, Saya no nakayama, how did I begin to drift betwixt and between into this affair?" Everything about this exchange for me hinges on omoi somekemu. The verb somu can be either to begin, as in this case, to begin to think about, or to be died with, to think deeply about. As with many poems, it really means both. So it's that much harder to translate. The phrase nakanaka ni can indicate doing something thoughtless or careless, but it can also be a wonderful way to suggest, in my mind at least, someone disappearing deeper and deeper, naka ni, into the mountain pass. My own casual take on the poem was so much like taking the Saya Pass to the east. What was I doing to allow my thoughts to become dyed with that person? To me, it seemed to work very nicely with the idea in the previous poem of the sunset deepening the blush of the already pink flowers. And I also like the contrast of nakanaka ni, entering deeper into the tortuous path, and the sound of crickets, kirigirisu, resembling actually the verb to cut. Whether these kinds of readings are truly possible depends on a sophisticated knowledge of the parameters of wordplay in classical literature, as well as precedents. Many times these poems were composed with a virtual library of poems in everyone's minds by people from generations past. And that is part of why anthologies like this one and others in the exhibition that go out of their way to include poems from different eras allow people to imagine, what if this person and that person had actually been able to compete, and if so, which poems would they have used? But it's thanks to scholars in the field, such as our curator of Japanese art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Felice Fisher, or Sadako Oki at the Yale University Art Gallery, and also John Carpenter at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who translated many of the poems for the catalog for the present exhibition, who are able to tell us, well, is this something possible? Could they have been thinking this? Or is that maybe something that's fun to imagine, but wouldn't really be possible in the special rules of the game? So in Toshinari's world, Sosei comes back at Kino Tomonori with the poem, and I think I will skip over the Japanese for time and also to save myself the embarrassment of my own pronunciation. You said you would come to see me right away. I waited and waited, and now I see the morning of the 9th month of the year. And that is the translation that John Carpenter provided in the present catalog. I found another version by Joshua Mostow in his book on the Hyakunin Ikkashu, where he translates it, I'll come right away. It is only because you said, I'll come right away, that I have ended up waiting for nothing more than the wan moon of this morning sky in this long 9th month. And there's yet another translation that is apparently one preferred by Kokin Wakashu scholars that says, it was only because you said you would come right away that I have waited these long months till even the wan morning moon has come out. What's nice about John Carpenter's translation is he says, and now I see the morning of the 9th month of the year. So he avoids choosing one of the interpretations over the other by allowing the translation to encompass both the idea that the person has waited until the latter part of a particular night in the 9th month when the moon would be waning and therefore visible in the morning, or an interpretation in which the person has waited not just the length of that particular night, but many months. The idea of a nagatsuki, many months, long months, rather than the 9th month of nagatsuki. In the case of this grouping of poems, what I like is that here, instead of the setting sun that dyes the already pink flower, or the person whose mind is dyed or infiltrated with the idea of someone, all Sosei's protagonist of his poem gets is a waning moon. The final poem in the match is from Kino Tomonori, and it reads, I have known the pain of a love held in too long. Let the jewel thread snap, the wild scattering begin. Spare me your amazement, world. And that translation comes from Edward Cranston. And there is no sense in this last poem that I could really find of the theme of the colors of the sun or the moon, or the thoughts in one's head deepening with the thought of someone, but rather there's this very taut snapping where someone has a transformative moment where the love that is held inside is released. So one can sort of imagine what Fujiwara Shunzei was thinking when he tried to put this particular poetry match together. So, am I out of time? Okay, so rather than to read any more poems, I will finish off simply with this amazing image, contrastive image of two poets in a Jidai Fudo Utawase, or competition of poets from different eras that also is on view upstairs, where you have this wonderful contrast between a young monk and an older monk, and the strength of the quality of the nisei, or likeness painting, so that even though you are not right there with the poets, you can sort of imagine their sensibility or their atmosphere. And so in conclusion, just as lineage serves as in part of the battle against impermanence in Buddhism, in the world of literature, the reenactment and reshuffling of poems composed at different times by different people becomes this way of both preserving in people's minds this virtual library of poems, but also enabling there to be these sort of ichigo, ichie, once in a lifetime experiences where only the participants getting together on a particular occasion are going to come up with particular interpretations that suit the mood of their gathering and group. So thank you very much, and I would love to take questions. So you can shout or come down to the mic. Yes.
It's not really a question, but I'm so intrigued by you're talking about the chanting element of the poetry contest. Do you have any audios, or can you direct our attention to any audios?
Actually...
Sorry, could you just repeat
the
question?
Yes. So it's not really a question, but it ended up being one. That poetry involves a sort of element of chanting, and could I direct people toward recordings of that? I can. I was able to find on the internet a recording of a Renga gathering at a small Tenjin shrine, I think in the Kyoto area, and I don't have the URL for that site right with me, but I do have it stored in my computer. So if you wanted to, I could provide it to Asia Society, and perhaps you could email into them and ask them if you can have the link. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any other one?
These poetry contests,
Uh-huh.
how long do they go on? For over hundreds of years, or during the time you mentioned it?
Well, they begin, we believe...
So the question, sorry.
Oh,
the question
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
The question is...
The microphone's here.
When do poetry contests begin, and how long over the course of Japanese history do they continue? I think we have a record of poetry contests from very early on, as early as, sort of 9th, 10th century in the Heian period. And then, I would argue that they continue to go on today. But certainly they were a major feature of court culture in the Heian period. And then as time goes on, Denga gatherings were like really hot in the Edo period. You still do have these kinds of poetry gatherings for haikai and as I was mentioning, John Carpenter at the Metropolitan Museum of Art has been an avid translator of kyoka poetry or comic, sort of humorous poems. So there are lots of different gatherings of different kinds, and I think it's something that still continues today for aficionados. Mm-hmm. Oh, actually, I have one more point I can mention on that the Reiwa, the new era name of the new Japanese emperor, they're very proud that it was taken this time not from a work of Chinese literature, classical literature, but rather from the Manyoshu, the first imperial poetry anthology, and it involves poetry that was produced at a gathering in Dazaifu in Kyushu. So it's even now people looking back to very early poetry anthologies for inspiration for the future. Mm-hmm. Oh, Philip is on the move. Hello.
I made it. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. So you mentioned that the hanging scroll of poetry that's displayed upstairs from Dr. Weber's collection was once originally part of an album, and or perhaps part of an album.
Well, actually, the hand scroll that has poems that are brushed by Sonnen Hoshinno was probably a dechobon or a book format, and because the papers are very narrow, and normally if something is originally a hand scroll, you have quite a good length of paper from horizontally, and these are so narrow, it's more likely that they were part of a book that folded. Yeah,
I see. So just in, I guess more generally, do you think taking an overall larger thing like an album or a hand scroll and converting that into a hanging scroll format, does that represent a changing and appreciation of a long format to a singular format? Or is that another part of the impermanence of Japanese
It's a wonderful
art?
point, is that preservation, whether it's an image of an icon or a section of a poetry anthology, trumps format. So if it's possible to preserve an icon, even if it means retailoring it for a new space, or if it means taking apart something that is in a book format, and as in this beautiful version from the 36 poetic immortals from Nishi Honganji, temple, also on view upstairs, and putting something in hanging scroll format that then enables it to be enjoyed by multiple people at the same time. All of these things are done over the centuries with the main motivator being preserving the work. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, if there are other questions that you don't want to ask in person from the audience, we can do some social distancing questioning afterwards. And I really appreciate, again, the opportunity to come and speak. It enabled me to put together work from my previous scholarship with really fascinating time looking into poems that is less something that I am specialized in, but deeply love. So I really appreciate it, and thank you.